When Doris Duke died, she left behind $1.2 billion, and the person she had put in charge of all of it was her butler. The person she chose was not a bank she had trusted for decades, and not a child because she had none left, and not a husband because those were long gone. It was a butler, a man she had hired a few years earlier to run her houses. The richest girl in the world, the little heiress the newspapers had chased since the day she was born, ended her life alone in a mansion above Los Angeles, while the people closest to her circled the largest private fortune in America. She had been born into that money in 1912, and the press crowned her the richest baby alive before she could walk. That was the start. By 1993, the whole story had turned around. She died with a fortune worth more than $2 billion in today's money, and not 1 cent of it would go to a single member of her family. It would take a court, 40 lawyers, and 3 years of legal war to decide who was even allowed to touch it. When the dust settled, the man she had trusted with everything, the butler, walked away with a settlement worth around $4.5 million, plus $500,000 a year for the rest of his life. That was the price just to make him let go. This is the story of a fortune you will never inherit, and of what happens to the one person who has everything except the thing that protects it. Because Doris Duke did not lose her money the way her old rival Barbara Hutton lost hers. Doris Duke's money survived, she did not. So how does the richest girl in the world end up dying alone, with strangers fighting over her $1 billion? The answer is a lesson about wealth that has nothing to do with how much of it you have. If you had asked anyone in America in 1925 about the Duke girl, they would have told you she was the luckiest child alive. They had no idea what that money would come to cost her. Her father was James Buchanan Duke, and he was not old money. He was a North Carolina farm boy who turned tobacco into an empire. When a machine came along that could roll cigarettes faster than any human hand, Duke bet everything on it, while his rivals hesitated, and within a few years his American Tobacco Company controlled something close to half the cigarettes sold in the country. It grew so dominant that the government broke it apart as a monopoly. And then Duke did the whole thing over again in a second industry. He dammed the rivers of the Carolinas and built a hydroelectric power company, the business that would grow into Duke Power, the utility that still lights millions of homes in the South today. Tobacco and electricity. Two of the things every American touched every single day, and James Buchanan Duke owned a piece of both. In 1924, near the end of his life, he set aside $40 million in a charitable trust and used part of it to transform a small college in North Carolina. The school renamed itself in honor of his family. That is why there is a Duke University today. It was named for the Dukes and above all for his own father, not for the little girl who would become the family's last chapter. That detail matters because people assume the university was named for Doris. It was not. It was named before she was old enough to have any say in it at all. He died in 1925. Doris was 12 years old. What she inherited has never been pinned to a single clean number because the estate was vast and it was split among the family. But every serious account puts her personal share somewhere between $60 and $100 million at a time when $100 million was one of the largest private fortunes in the United States. In today's money, that is well over $1 billion. And the newspapers, who had already named her the richest little girl in the world when she was a baby, now had their headline confirmed. A 12-year-old, the second richest person in the country by some counts, with no father, and a fortune the whole world wanted to look at. Here is the part that gets buried under all the zeros. It was a miserable way to grow up. Sally Bingham, who wrote the most thorough biography of Doris Duke using the heiress's own papers, now archived at Duke University, describes a childhood spent behind walls, guarded against kidnappers, watched over by adults who were sizing her up for what she was worth. Doris said her father had given her one piece of advice before he died: trust no one. She would spend the rest of her life proving how hard that advice was to follow, and how right the old man had been to give it. The money reached her in stages, larger portions unlocking as she turned 21, then 25, then 30. When her mother died in 1962, she inherited another $250 million on top of everything else. So the fortune was not just enormous, it kept climbing. The size of it made her a target from the moment she could sign her own name. When Doris turned 21 and the first great block of the fortune came under her control, the newspapers covered it like a coronation. She feuded with her own mother over money and property. Fortune hunters pursued her across 2 continents. Men who looked at a young woman and calculated a dowry. The advice her father had given her, trust no one, was not the bitter line of a cold man. It was a survival manual, and Doris had to learn to read it young, because everyone who walked into her life had already done the math on what she was worth. Now, the easy version of the story is that she was a spoiled heiress who sat on a pile of money and did nothing. That version is wrong, and it matters because the woman who dies alone at the end of this is not a cartoon. Doris Duke was, by any honest measure, formidable. During the Second World War, she ran a canteen for sailors in Egypt and took a salary of $1 a year. In 1945, she became a foreign correspondent for the International News Service, filing dispatches from a wrecked post-war Europe, and later wrote for Harper's Bazaar out of Paris. She taught herself to be a serious collector of Islamic art decades before it was fashionable in America, and built Shangri-La, a home in Honolulu filled with tile and textiles and whole carved rooms she commissioned from craftsmen across the Muslim world. That house is a public museum of Islamic art today, one of the finest collections of its kind in the country. She became one of the earliest serious historic preservationists in America. In 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation and saved dozens of colonial buildings in Rhode Island that would otherwise have met the wrecking ball, along with her own Newport mansion, Rough Point, which is a museum now. Down in New Jersey, she created a vast public botanical garden at Duke Farms. Preservation was not a hobby for her, it was a second career. The Newport she helped save is the Newport tourists walk through today, block after block of 18th century houses that would have been torn down for parking lots and low rises without her checkbook and her stubbornness. She bought the doomed buildings, restored them, and rented them out to keep them standing. It was patient, unglamorous work, the opposite of the jet-set heiress the tabloids wrote about, and she did it for decades. The woman had range. That is part of what makes the last act so hard to accept. And across her lifetime, she took the fortune her father left her and grew it, about fourfold. She was not the woman who spent an empire into the ground. She was the woman who guarded one and made it bigger. Which is what makes the ending so strange. To understand it, you have to meet the other richest girl in the world, because there were 2 of them, and they were bound together their whole lives. In the same city, in the same year, 1912, about a week apart, 2 heiresses were born. One was Doris Duke, the tobacco fortune, The other was Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth 5 and dime fortune. The press could not resist it. Two of the richest baby girls in the country, born a week apart, and reporters started calling the pair the Gold Dust Twins. If you have seen the story of Barbara Hutton, you already know how her side ends. She inherited around $50 million, close to $900 million in today's money, and she died in 1979 with about $3,500 to her name. That is the figure her biographers cite. 7 marriages, most of them to men who spent her money and then collected a settlement on the way out the door. A fortune poured through her hands like water through a sieve. And here's the detail that stitches the two women together at the seam. One man married both of them. His name was Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican playboy who built a career out of marrying rich women. He married Doris Duke in 1947. When it ended a little over a year later, she sent him off with polo ponies, sports cars, and a converted bomber plane. A few years on, he married Barbara Hutton. That marriage lasted 53 days. The story goes that before Hutton married the man, her own aunt begged her to telephone Doris Duke first and ask what he was like. 2 richest girls in the world, one traveling con of a husband, passed from the first to the second like a bad stock tip. Rubirosa was only the most famous of the men who circled these 2 fortunes. Both women spent their lives being married for their money, and both kept paying for the privilege on the way out. Doris handed Rubirosa a fortune in parting gifts. Hutton handed her 7 husbands settlement after settlement, with a single exception, the actor Cary Grant, who by every account took nothing from her and wanted nothing but her company. He was the one husband who did not treat her as a bank. The rest of the pattern held with grim regularity, and it is the first clue to why 2 enormous fortunes, born in the same week, ended so far apart. Keep both women in mind, because at the end, this story is going to set them side by side, and the gap between how they finish is the whole point. Doris did have one chance at the family you would picture around a fortune like this. In 1940, married to her first husband, she gave birth to a daughter in Honolulu, a girl she named Arden. The baby came far too early, and she lived only a single day. Doris never had another child. That quiet loss, one day long, is the hinge the entire ending turns on, because it meant the richest woman in America would grow old with no son, no daughter, no direct heir. No one whose job it was, by blood, to look out for her when she could no longer look out for herself. That was only round 1 of the isolation. As Doris moved into her 70s, the circle around her began to shrink, the way it does around the very rich and the very alone. Old friends drifted off or passed away. She had no children and no close family she trusted. And into that emptiness stepped the staff, the people paid to run her days. That is not a scandal by itself. It is the plain physics of being wealthy and old and alone. The person who runs your household starts to run your life. They decide which calls get returned and which do not. They decide who is allowed to sit by the bed. Estate lawyers have a name for how this unfolds. It starts with access. The insider becomes the one who schedules the visits, screens the calls, and stands in the room for every conversation. Then it becomes dependence, as failing health hands over more and more of daily life. And at the very end, it becomes control, when a vulnerable person signs what is put in front of them, because the one holding the pen is the only face they still see each day. None of it has to look like a crime while it happens. It can look like devoted service, right up until the will is read. The man who ended up in that seat was named Bernard Lafferty. He was an Irish-born butler she had hired in 1987, and over the following years he rose from staff to constant companion, traveling the world with her, running her houses, and becoming, in the words of the lawyers who later fought over all of this, the person closest to her. A butler who had started by pouring the drinks was now the man who stood between Doris Duke and everyone else on Earth. Then her health gave way, and it gave way fast. She was a woman in her late 70s chasing the body of a younger one. There was cosmetic surgery. A bad fall broke her hip while she was under heavy medication. 2 knee replacement operations came in a single year, 1993, and after the second one, a severe stroke. In her last months, she moved in and out of hospitals, dependent on painkillers and dependent on the people who handed them to her. The woman who had run canteens and filed war dispatches and built museums could no longer keep watch over the person managing her checkbook. The clock was already ticking. She just could not hear it yet. And around 6 months before she died, Doris Duke made the decision that turned a sad story into a legal war. She rewrote who would control her estate. Pushed aside was her previous executor, a friend and former doctor, and in his place, she named Bernard Lafferty, her butler, as the executor of her entire fortune. On top of that, she lined him up for a role helping to run the charitable foundation her money was destined for. A bank, U.S. Trust Company of New York, was named as co-executor beside him, the supposed professional check on the whole arrangement. Hold on to that detail. It matters more than anything else in the story. The changes did not come all at once. In her last years, as her health declined, Doris Duke revised her wishes again and again, and each revision, according to the accounts that later filled the court file, moved more control toward the man at her side. Former staff described a household where the path to Doris ran through one person. They described documents signed by a woman who was gravely ill. Whether that crossed the legal line into undue influence was never settled by a verdict, because the fight ended in a deal. But the sheer number of late change-it-alls, each one pointing the same direction, was enough to make a judge look very hard at how the richest woman in America had spent her final signatures. If you're getting something out of this, here's a question worth sitting with before we go on. If you had $1 billion and no family left, who would you trust to carry out your wishes? Hold that thought, because the people Doris Duke chose are about to show you how hard that question is to answer. Doris Duke died on the 28th of October, 1993, at her estate in the hills above Los Angeles. She was 80 years old. The official cause was pulmonary edema leading to cardiac arrest following the stroke. Now, this is where the story took a turn nobody saw coming, at least not out in the open. In the litigation that followed, a private nurse alleged that Duke's death had been hastened. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office investigated the claim and found no firm evidence of foul play, and no charges were ever brought against anyone. What the courts did establish, in cold and documented detail, was not about how she died. It was about what happened to the money the instant she did. Because the will read like a heist in slow motion. The bulk of the $1.2 billion fortune was left to charity, which was Doris Duke's genuine, lifelong wish. But the person handed the keys to all of it was Bernard Lafferty. The butler was now executor of a $1 billion estate, positioned to help govern the foundation, and set to receive a personal payout the will valued at around $5 million, plus $500,000 a year for life. A man who a few years earlier had been staff was now, on paper, one of the most influential figures in American philanthropy. That was the story the public saw. Behind the scenes, the machinery of a great fortune defending itself was grinding into motion, and it started with the people who had been cut out of the will. The challenge came fast, and it came from several directions at once. The doctor and former executor Doris had pushed aside led the fight to remove Lafferty. Former employees came forward with accounts of her last isolated years, of a will changed several times as her health failed, of a woman too weak to manage the man who was managing her. The accusation at the center of it all was undue influence, the legal term for when someone applies so much pressure on a vulnerable person that the choices stop being their own. Nobody was ever required to prove it to a final verdict, because the case settled before it got that far. But the accusation alone was enough to freeze the estate and put the butler on trial in every way that counted. It became a spectacle. For the better part of 3 years, the Duke estate war filled newspapers and gossip columns, a cast of doctors, lawyers, former employees, and one Irish butler all fighting over the largest fortune ever to land in a probate court. The proceedings crawled through New York's surrogates court, the quiet corner of the legal system that handles the estates of the dead, a place built for paperwork that had now become the arena for a billion-dollar brawl. Every side hired its own experts. Every claim spawned a counterclaim. And the meter on all those lawyers ran the entire time, paid out of the very fortune everyone claimed to be protecting. What followed was one of the largest estate battles in American history. Around 40 lawyers, spread across 10 law firms, fought over the Duke fortune for almost 3 years in New York's surrogates court in front of a judge named Eve Preminger. The legal fees alone ran past $10 million. That is the kind of number that makes accountants cry. And it was all in service of one question. Who was fit to control the $1 billion Doris Duke left behind? The answer the court gave is the reason this video exists. In 1995, Judge Preminger removed Bernard Lafferty as executor. The finding was blunt. He had been using estate funds for his own support. He was spending the dead woman's money on himself before a single dollar of it had reached the charity it was meant for. But the judge did not stop there. And this is the part that turns the story into a lesson. She also removed U.S. Trust, the professional bank, the supposed adult in the room, the co-executor whose entire job was oversight. The court found that the bank had failed to do anything to stop him. It had sat there, collecting its fee, while the fortune it was paid to guard was being drained. Read that back. The court fired the predator and the watchman in the same ruling. It fired the bank for watching. That is the moment the structure did what the person never could. Doris Duke, alone and sick, had no one to protect her at the end. But her money sat inside a structure that did have a protector, a court with the power to reach in, throw out the people looting it, and start over. In 1996, a settlement closed the war. Lafferty gave up his role as executor and his seat at the foundation in exchange for a reduced payout, around $4.5 million plus that $500,000 a year for life. He did not enjoy it for long. He died later that same year. And in his place, the court installed the thing Doris Duke's personal life had never had: professional, accountable oversight. A board of serious, independent trustees was appointed to run the estate and the foundation, people with real reputations to protect, among them the president of Duke University and the head of a major Wall Street firm. The New York Attorney General, whose office is charged with watching over charitable money in that state, stood behind the arrangement. One dependent insider was replaced by a wall of institutions. That is the whole difference in a single sentence. One person can be flattered, worn down, or fooled. A wall of institutions, a bank watched by a court watched by the state, is far harder to capture all at once, because each part is checking the others. It is slower, it is colder, and it has none of the warmth of a trusted friend at the bedside. But it is exactly that coldness that makes it safe. The people who design these structures are not trying to replace love. They are trying to make sure that when love is absent, or worse, when it is counterfeit, the money still ends up where it was promised to go. The result is the quiet victory buried inside the downfall. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation was established in 1996, and it did not just survive the war over her estate, it thrived. Today, that foundation holds more than $2 billion in assets, more than she died with, and in a single recent year, it handed out $62 million in grants, funding medical research, the arts, the environment, and animal welfare, the exact causes she cared about in life. The money reached its purpose. The Butler did not. Look at what that money does now. The Doris Duke Foundation funds cancer and infectious disease research in hospitals across the country. It commissions and sustains American choreographers, composers, and stage artists. It protects wildlife habitat and farmland, and it keeps up the 3 great houses she left behind: Shangri-La in Honolulu, Rough Point in Newport, and Duke Farms in New Jersey, all of them open to the public. Decade after decade, the checks go out in the name of a woman who trusted almost no one, to causes that outlived every person who ever tried to get close to her money. It is the strangest kind of monument, one made only of good the donor never lived to see. But do not mistake that for a happy ending, because it is not one. To see why, set the 2 gold dust twins back side by side, the way they started, born a week apart in 1912. Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, held her fortune in her own 2 hands. There was no wall of institutions around it, no court standing guard, nothing at all between her money and the 7 husbands who married it. She trusted the wrong people over and over, and there was no structure to catch her when she did. She died with about $3,500. Think about how much money that is to burn through. $50 million in 1933, the year Hutton came into it, would be close to $1 billion today. She owned homes on 3 continents, jewels that had belonged to royalty, and an income most nations would envy. And it all drained away. A divorce settlement here, a piece of bad financial advice there, a way of living no fortune could outrun. Until the woman once called the richest girl in the world was, at the finish, a cautionary line in a history book. No court stepped in for Barbara Hutton, because there was no structure for a court to step into. Her money was hers, and then it was gone. Doris Duke also trusted the wrong person at the end. She made the same human mistake Hutton did, handing her fortune to someone who had not earned it. The only difference, and it is the entire difference, is that Duke's money sat inside a structure that could survive her bad judgment, and Hutton's did not. One woman's fortune was captured and then clawed back by a court. The other woman's just vanished. Same starting line, same year, same title, even the same husband for a while. One died leaving a foundation that still writes checks today. The other died with the price of a used car. The gap between those 2 endings is not luck, and it is not the size of the fortune. It is structure. You see the same pattern in the other great lonely fortune of that era. Huguette Clark, daughter of the copper baron William Clark, was worth hundreds of millions, and she spent the last 20 years of her life not in any of her empty mansions, but in a plain hospital room, a recluse, childless, surrounded by staff who had a great deal to gain. She lived to 104. She left most of her fortune, in a will signed when she was in her late 90s, to a nurse in a foundation, and 19 distant relatives descended on the estate the moment she was gone. Her nurse alone had received around $30 million in gifts over the years. It settled the way these things settle, with tens of millions going in every direction and the lawyers taking their cut. Clark's story ended in a bigger mess than Duke's. There was no grand charitable structure with the court and an attorney general standing guard from the start, only a contested will and a pile of last-minute gifts. The distant relatives, most of them near strangers to her, walked away with tens of millions. Her nurse gave some of the gifts back, and the lesson repeats. When the structure is thin, a fortune gets divided by whoever shows up with a lawyer, not by the wishes of the person who earned it. Duke had armor. Clark had a hospital room and a handful of documents, and her fortune scattered to whoever pressed hardest. It is the same machine every time. An isolated heiress, the circling handlers, and a fight over the corpse of a fortune. People who study elder financial abuse now teach the Duke case as a textbook example, and the lesson they draw from it is not complicated. Being rich is not the danger. The danger is being rich, old, alone, and unprotected, with no independent check on the one person who controls your day. What saves a fortune in that situation is never the size of it. It is the structure around it. A trust instead of a handshake. An independent trustee instead of a trusted insider. A court that can remove a thief and remove the watchman who let the thief in. Doris Duke's charity had that armor. Doris Duke, the woman, did not. And here's the uncomfortable truth underneath the lesson. The very instinct that protects a fortune can leave the person exposed. Doris Duke built walls around her money, trusts and foundations, and corporate trustees, the whole apparatus of the ultra-rich. But she never built walls around herself. She kept no independent circle, no family, no board of her own life, no one whose only job was to look out for Doris. The money was surrounded by professionals. The woman was surrounded by employees. When those two things came into conflict at the very end, the money had somewhere to turn. She did not. So think back to where we began. The richest girl in the world, dead at 80 in a house full of people she paid, her $1 billion in the hands of her butler. What survived was the money. And it survived because of the boring machinery of trusts and courts and boards that stood between it and the people trying to take it. What did not survive was the family. The Duke line ended with Doris. There was no child, no heir, no next generation. The tobacco and power fortune that James Buchanan Duke built and that his daughter guarded and grew for 60 years does not belong to a single Duke alive today. It belongs to a foundation run by strangers, doing good work in her name forever. That was the bargain in the end. The money got to live. The dynasty did not. There is one more American family we have to talk about, though, and their fall makes even this one look gentle. Because Doris Duke, for all her loneliness, at least chose where her fortune went. The next family never got that mercy. They were the undisputed rulers of American high society, the name that decided who was in and who was out for half a century, the family every other family wanted to be. And then, one by one, they lost the money, the mansions, and at last, even the name itself. That story is next.